Good evening. Tonight we descend into the history of a molecule, a single arrangement of carbon, hydrogen and nitrogen. So small it dissolves into invisibility, so powerful it rewired the 20th century. It has lived many lives. It has worn many names. It has been carried in the breast pockets of bomber pilots at 30,000 feet, stirred into chocolate bars and handed to soldiers crossing the frozen Ardennes, pressed into the palms of suburban housewives told it would make them thin, and placed, with the full blessing of the United States government, onto the tongues of children as young as 6 years old every morning before the school bus arrives. The same molecule, every time. This is not a story about medicine. It is not quite a story about drugs. It is the story of a civilization that became dependent on a single chemical compound, dressed it in different clothes for each generation, and convinced itself, each time with perfect sincerity, that this time was different, that this time it was science, that this time it was care. It was not different. This is the complete history of Adderall. Before we go further, if these quiet journeys into the darker corners of history bring you some peace at the end of a long day, take a moment right now to like and subscribe before you close your eyes, and leaving a comment telling me where in the world you are tonight. It moves me every time, knowing how many corners of the earth gather here in the dark. But now, dim the light a little more, set the phone face down, and let us begin at the beginning, which is not, as it turns out, in a pharmaceutical laboratory. It is in a city that does not yet know what it has made, in the hands of a man who is not looking for what he is about to find. Settle in. We have a long way to go. In the autumn of 1887, in a laboratory in Berlin, a Romanian chemist named Lazar Edeleanu synthesized a molecule he called phenylisopropylamine. He noted its existence. He wrote it down. He moved on. For reasons that history does not fully explain, perhaps the molecule seemed too simple. Perhaps there were more pressing questions to pursue. Edeleanu filed his findings away and turned his attention elsewhere. The compound sat in the literature for 40 years, a chemical ghost in the basement of pharmacology. No one tried it on animals. No one tried it on themselves. No one imagined in the autumn of 1887 that this modest arrangement of atoms would one day be responsible for fueling the greatest military conflict in human history, collapsing the diet industry of an entire decade, and eventually finding its way into the lunchboxes of American schoolchildren under a name that sounded like it had been designed by a team of marketing consultants, which, in a sense, it had. 40 years passed. The world changed enormously in those 40 years. The automobile arrived. The airplane arrived. 2 empires collapsed, and new nations rose from their rubble. Insulin was discovered. Penicillin was waiting, nearly found, not quite yet. Medicine was becoming something new. Not the art of managing suffering, but the science of eliminating it. Pharmaceutical companies were beginning to understand that a molecule, correctly packaged, correctly named, correctly aimed at the anxieties of a population, could be worth more than a factory, more than a railroad, more than a fleet of ships. Into this world, in the late 1920s, stepped a Los Angeles chemist named Gordon Alice. Alice was 30 years old, meticulous, and possessed of the particular ambition that belongs to researchers who believe they are close to something. He was not looking for stimulants. He was not interested in the mind or its acceleration. He was interested in the most practical of senses, in lungs. Specifically, in the lungs of people with asthma, a condition for which the primary treatment of the era was ephedrine, a compound derived from a Chinese plant called mahuang, which had been used in traditional medicine for thousands of years and which had recently been synthesized and brought to Western pharmacies. Ephedrine worked. The problem was that it was expensive. The plant from which it came was not easy to cultivate at scale, and the process of isolating the active compound was laborious, slow, and dependent on supply chains that stretched across oceans. What Alice wanted, what the pharmaceutical industry wanted, though it did not yet know it wanted it, was a substitute. A cheaper molecule that could do what ephedrine did, but could be synthesized in a laboratory from common materials, without the inconvenience of botany. He did not find what he was looking for. What he found instead was considerably more interesting. In 1927, working through a series of compounds related to ephedrine, Alice came across the 40-year-old description of Adelianu's forgotten molecule. He synthesized it himself. He tested it on animals. The results were suggestive. Elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, the physiological signature of stimulation, but inconclusive about its usefulness as an asthma treatment. A cautious man might have set it aside. Alice was not, in this particular moment, a cautious man. On June 3rd, 1929, a doctor injected 50 milligrams of the compound directly into Gordon Alice's body. What followed was meticulous. Alice kept notes. He recorded that the substance produced a distinct sense of well-being, a lifting, an elevation of mood that was clean and purposeful. Nothing like the agitation of caffeine. Quieter than that, more certain, more architectural. He noted heightened alertness, an unusual willingness to focus, a sense that the mind had been organized in some manner that had previously eluded it. He also noted that he could not sleep for the next several hours, which was, in retrospect, a useful piece of data. He did not note that he had just introduced a molecule that would, within 2 decades, be administered to hundreds of millions of soldiers across every major theater of the most destructive war in human history. He was thinking about asthma. He could be forgiven for not seeing that far ahead. As an asthma treatment, the compound proved to be a disappointment. Alice tested it on actual patients. He gave one woman 20 milligrams orally. 2 hours later, she was still wheezing, despite describing feelings of considerable euphoria. He tried higher doses. They helped the asthma somewhat, but produced headaches, nausea, a restless unease that made the cure feel only marginally preferable to the disease. As a bronchodilator, the molecule had no future, but the euphoria, that was something else entirely. Alice began to understand that what he had synthesized was not a lung drug. It was a brain drug. The lungs were not interested. The brain was extremely interested. And the pharmaceutical industry, watching from a careful distance, was beginning to be extremely interested in the brain's interest. He received a patent on the compound's orally active salts in 1932. The same year, the Philadelphia pharmaceutical firm Smith, Kline, and French, already watching Alice's work with the particular attention that corporations pay to profitable surprises, patented the base form of the compound themselves. They had a name for it, a brand name, clean and clinical, built from the syllables of its original technical designation. They called it Benzedrine. The first product was an inhaler, a small aluminum tube, sealed at one end, containing 325 milligrams of oily amphetamine base, enough, as it turned out, to produce a fairly intense stimulant experience if the user was sufficiently motivated to extract its contents, which many users turned out to be. The inhaler was marketed as a nasal decongestant. It was sold over the counter, at any pharmacy, without a prescription, for anyone. This is perhaps the first moment in the story of this molecule where one is compelled to pause and simply sit with the arithmetic. 325 milligrams, over the counter, no prescription. This is a number worth holding for a moment in the quiet of wherever you are listening from tonight, because it is the number that explains a great deal of what happens next. By 1934, Alice had sold his patent on the compound salts to Smith, Klein, and French, receiving in exchange a royalty arrangement that would make him a wealthy man. The company expanded rapidly into Benzedrine sulfate tablets, a form that could be swallowed rather than inhaled, and began marketing them with the methodical ambition of a company that had understood before most that the line between medicine and want was considerably thinner than the public imagined. The American Medical Association approved advertising of Benzedrine sulfate tablets in 1937. The approved indications were narcolepsy, post-encephalitic Parkinsonism, and what the era called minor depression. Within a year, advertisements were appearing in medical journals showing pleasant-faced people carrying their days with an ease that the copy implied was chemical in origin. The language was restrained. The implication was not. Here is a detail that is easy to skip over, but perhaps should not be. The AMA's approval system at this time was essentially voluntary. Pharmaceutical companies submitted data to a panel of academic medical experts who evaluated it and, if satisfied, allowed the company to advertise in medical journals. This was not regulation in the way we understand regulation today. It was closer to a gentleman's agreement, governed by the assumption that companies submitting data had no particular interest in submitting incomplete data. This assumption would, in time, be tested. But in the late 1930s, Benzedrine was everywhere that medicine touched daily life. Narcolepsy, depression, low blood pressure, chronic fatigue, obesity. The list of approved and semi-approved uses grew with the molecule's reputation. Physicians prescribed it with the confidence of a profession that had recently acquired penicillin and was feeling, collectively, that the pharmaceutical era had arrived and that caution was something for the generations before the war. Before the war. Everything that happened with this molecule before the war was prelude. It is worth considering, as you settle into the weight of this story, what it meant that a compound discovered by accident in Berlin in 1887, forgotten for 40 years, rediscovered by a man looking for a cheaper asthma remedy, and commercialized by a Philadelphia pharmaceutical company by the mid-1930s, was now sitting in enormous quantities in warehouses and pharmacy shelves and physician sample bags, waiting for the world to find a reason large enough to consume it all. The world was about to provide that reason. By 1938, the German pharmaceutical company Daimler-Werk had synthesized their own version of the compound, methamphetamine, structurally nearly identical to amphetamine, one carbon atom and two hydrogen atoms different, pharmacologically more potent and longer lasting. They pressed it into tablets. They gave it a name, Pervitin. And as the Wehrmacht began its preparations for a war that would require its soldiers to fight without sleep, without fear, and without rest for days at a stretch across the frozen plains of Europe, The German military began to understand that Pervitin was not a pharmaceutical curiosity. It was infrastructure. By the spring of 1940, as the German army executed its audacious invasion of France and the Low Countries, a campaign that stunned Allied commanders with its speed and relentlessness, a campaign that seemed to violate the basic physics of human endurance. Temmler-Werke was supplying the Wehrmacht with 35 million Pervitin tablets in a span of 3 months. Soldiers at Dunkirk covered an average of 22 miles per day for 10 consecutive days. British newspapers ran headlines about drugged German pilots, doped infantry, moving with inhuman persistence. The coverage was not wrong. It was merely incomplete. Because at the same moment those headlines were being written, the British military was conducting its own experiments. And the Americans were watching both. And the molecule that Gordon Ellis had injected into himself in a Los Angeles laboratory in 1929, looking for something to open constricted airways, was about to become the fuel of the largest armed conflict in the history of civilization. What no one was asking in the autumn of 1940 was a question that would not be formulated clearly for another 50 years. What happens when the war ends and the pills don't? There is a particular kind of silence that follows a war, not the silence of peace. That is a different thing entirely, warm and earned and full of the sounds of ordinary life reasserting itself. This is a colder silence, the silence of institutions that have done something they do not quite know how to discuss, the silence of governments that have handed an experimental stimulant to millions of young men, watched those young men perform extraordinary and terrible things under its influence, and are now faced with the administrative question of what to do about the fact that many of those young men have come home with a chemical companion they did not arrive with. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, the war itself. To understand what the Second World War did to this molecule, to understand why the story of Adderall cannot be told without spending time in the cockpits of British bombers and the supply depots of the American Eighth Army, you have to understand the scale of what happened. Not the scale of the conflict, which you likely already carry some sense of, but the specific scale of the pharmaceutical decision that was made quietly and systematically by every major military power between 1939 and 1945. The decision stated plainly was this: human endurance was insufficient for modern warfare, and chemistry would compensate for the difference. The Germans arrived at this conclusion first. In the winter of 1939, as the Wehrmacht was planning its western offensive, the German military surgeon Otto Ranke conducted a series of experiments on university students and soldiers, testing the effects of Pervitin on cognitive performance under conditions of sustained fatigue. His findings were unambiguous enough that he wrote a memorandum recommending the drug's widespread distribution. The military did not deliberate for long. Between April and December of 1939, the Temmler-Werke Company supplied the German armed forces with 29 million Pervitin tablets. This number is worth saying again: 29 million tablets in 8 months, before a single major engagement of the war had occurred. By April of 1940, as the Blitzkrieg swept into France with a speed that defied the expectations of Allied strategists who had been planning for the slow grinding warfare of 1914, German soldiers were taking Pervitin in quantities that the military itself had not fully anticipated. Some units reported soldiers taking up to 4 tablets per day. The Wehrmacht pressed through the Ardennes, terrain that Allied commanders had judged essentially impassable for armored vehicles. In 72 hours, Panzer divisions moved at night. Infantry divisions followed at a pace that would, under normal biochemical conditions, have been physiologically impossible to sustain. The British newspapers, as already noted, ran headlines about drugged soldiers. What the British newspapers did not mention was that the British military had, by this point, already begun its own parallel program. The Royal Air Force had been watching. RAF aircrews flying night missions over Germany were returning from operations in states of exhaustion that were, in the grim mathematics of wartime, unacceptable. A fatigued pilot is a dead pilot, and frequently a dead crew, and the RAF could not afford the attrition that fatigue was producing. In November of 1942, the Air Ministry formally approved the use of Benzedrine sulfate for operational aircrews. The guidance issued to crews was carefully worded. The drug was approved not as a performance enhancer, but as a tool for preventing the degradation of performance under extreme fatigue. The distinction was considered important. It is unclear, from a pharmacological standpoint, that the distinction was meaningful. By 1945, 15% of RAF fighter pilots were using Benzedrine tablets whenever they judged themselves sufficiently tired to require them. This was not coercion. This was not a mandatory program. This was 15% of a professional military air force deciding on their own authority that the chemistry of a wartime stimulant was a reasonable solution to the problem of being expected to fly complex machinery through hostile airspace for 8 to 12 hours at a stretch. One can hardly argue with the logic. The Americans came to the same logic by a somewhat different route. When the United States entered the war in December of 1941, the military's relationship with amphetamine was still tentative, observational rather than committed. American commanders had watched the German Blitzkrieg with the attention of people who understood, viscerally, that they would eventually be fighting the army that had executed it. They had also watched the RAF's adoption of Benzedrine with the attention of allies who shared intelligence and, when the intelligence was useful, shared the underlying policy. By 1942, Benzedrine tablets, known among American servicemen as bennies, a nickname that carried the warm familiarity of something that had already become ordinary, were being added to the emergency kits of American bomber crews. The reasoning was identical to the RAF's Endurance, a bomber crew flying a mission from England to Germany and back, was in the air for 8 to 12 hours. They were doing this not once, but repeatedly, on rotation schedules that allowed for minimal recovery time. The mathematics of sustained aerial warfare demanded that human bodies perform beyond what human bodies, in their natural, unaugmented state, were designed to perform. In 1943, the program extended to infantry. And then, General Dwight D. Eisenhower made a decision that, in retrospect, may be one of the most consequential pharmaceutical procurement decisions in American history, though it was never described in those terms, and was, at the time, simply considered sound military planning. When American forces landed in North Africa in 1942, preparing to engage German and Italian forces in the desert campaigns that would eventually push the Axis out of the African theater, Eisenhower ordered 500,000 Benzedrine tablets to be supplied to his troops. 500,000 tablets. This was not a suggestion. This was a quartermaster's request, processed through official military channels fulfilled by Smith, Kline, and French's production facilities in Philadelphia, and shipped across the Atlantic as a standard military supply item alongside ammunition, food, and fuel. Around the same time, in the Egyptian desert, General Bernard Montgomery was preparing his 8th Army for the Second Battle of El Alamein, the engagement that would, in the assessment of many historians, mark the beginning of the end for German forces in North Africa. On the night of October 23, 1942, as his forces prepared to advance, Montgomery issued 100,000 Benzedrine pills to his troops, 100,000 tablets, in a single night, before a single battle. The British on amphetamine defeated the Germans on methamphetamine. This fact is not, it should be said, as straightforwardly simple as that sentence implies. Battles are decided by logistics and leadership and terrain and the 10,000 contingencies of organized violence, not merely by the chemistry of the participants. But the fact that both sides were operating under the influence of structurally similar stimulants, and that military historians have largely footnoted this detail rather than centering it, is itself a piece of information worth sitting with quietly in the dark. By the end of the war, the United States military had issued somewhere between 250 million and 500 million Benzedrine tablets to American servicemen. The range in estimates is not imprecision. It reflects a genuine gap in the historical record caused by the fact that while we know the value of government contracts with Smith, Kline, and French, the procurement price per tablet was never made uniformly public. What we know with confidence is the lower bound, 250 million tablets. What we suspect, based on the contract values, is that the actual number may have been double that. 15% of American soldiers were, by the end of the war, regular users of Benzedrine. This is not a small number. 15% of the 8 million Americans who served in uniform between 1941 and 1945 is approximately 1.2 million people, 1.2 million young men, most of them between 18 and 25 years old, most of them from towns and cities across the American interior that had never had any particular relationship with pharmaceutical stimulants, most of them with no prior experience of the specific chemistry of amphetamine, were, by the war's end, accustomed to the feeling of a tablet dissolving and the subsequent lifting of fatigue, the sharpening of attention, the sense that the body's limits were negotiable rather than fixed. And then the war ended, and the tablets did not. This is where the story takes a turn that historians of the period have sometimes treated as an unfortunate postscript, but which is, in fact, the hinge on which everything that follows swings. The men came home, the pharmaceutical infrastructure that had supplied them, the production lines, the distribution networks, the regulatory frameworks that had treated amphetamine as a legitimate medical supply item, did not dismantle itself simply because the immediate military purpose had been served. Smith, Kline, and French had spent a decade and a half building one of the most efficient pharmaceutical production and distribution systems in American history around this molecule. They were not going to stop. The question was not whether Benzedrine would continue to be produced and sold. Of course it would. The economics were too favorable, the infrastructure too established. The question was what peacetime purpose it would be aimed at. The answer was found quickly. Benzedrine, the post-war marketing materials began to suggest, was useful for fatigue. Not battlefield fatigue, domestic fatigue, the fatigue of the working man, the fatigue of the housewife managing a household and a social calendar, and the particular exhaustion of mid-century American femininity. The fatigue more broadly of a population that had survived a depression and a world war, and was now being asked to build, consume, and perform at a pace that the post-war economic boom demanded. By the late 1940s, Benzedrine was being prescribed for what physicians of the era called mild depression, a diagnostic category flexible enough to contain almost any presentation of sadness, listlessness, or insufficient enthusiasm for the demands of daily life. Advertisements in medical journals showed images of people restored to competence and sociability by the medication, their posture better, their expressions cleaner, their apparent relationship to their own lives clarified by the chemistry in their bloodstreams. The returning veteran, meanwhile, was managing something that post-war America did not have adequate language to describe. What we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder was then called, variously, combat fatigue, battle exhaustion, or nothing at all. Silence being the dominant cultural technology for processing what men had seen and done and lost. The stimulant that had gotten them through the war was still available. The prescription was easy to obtain. The feeling it produced was familiar in a way that peacetime had, for many of them, not yet become. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, extended the military relationship with amphetamine into another generation of servicemen. Dextroamphetamine, a refined, more potent variant of Arliss's original compound, separated out from the mixed racemic form by pharmaceutical chemists who had spent the war years improving their product, became standard issue in the Korean theater. The pipeline continued. The chemical knowledge continued. The population of Americans with direct personal experience of amphetamine's effects continued to grow. By the mid-1950s, something peculiar was happening in American medicine. Amphetamine was everywhere that medicine touched anxiety, weight, mood, or performance. It was prescribed for narcolepsy, which was legitimate. It was prescribed for depression, which was arguable. It was prescribed for obesity, which was lucrative. It was prescribed for what some physicians simply called chronic fatigue, a diagnosis capacious enough to accommodate essentially any patient who presented as insufficiently energetic by the standards of their physician's expectations. The pharmaceutical companies watched the prescription data with the attention that pharmaceutical companies pay to prescription data, and one category was growing faster than the others: obesity. Amphetamine suppresses appetite. This is a side effect of the stimulant mechanism. The same neurochemical pathway that elevates mood and sharpens attention also suppresses hunger, which means that a drug prescribed for concentration or mood would reliably produce as a secondary effect weight loss. In a post-war America increasingly preoccupied with the aesthetics of the body, this secondary effect was becoming, in certain quarters of the pharmaceutical industry, more commercially interesting than any of the primary indications. The diet pill market was about to be born, and the molecule that Gordon Alice had synthesized in 1927, looking for a cheaper way to treat asthma, was about to find its most profitable peacetime costume. But before we follow it into the diet clinics and the Brooklyn pharmaceutical companies and the FDA approval letters of the 1950s and 1960s, it is worth pausing here in this moment of post-war transition and asking a question that almost no one was asking at the time. 15% of American soldiers came home as regular users of a Schedule II equivalent stimulant. The government had issued it to them. The government had implicitly endorsed its daily use as a tool of military effectiveness. The government had, through its procurement decisions and its medical approval processes, built a pharmaceutical infrastructure around a molecule that it simultaneously classified, when used non-medically, as dangerous. The soldier who had taken his bennies before a night patrol in the Pacific was not an addict. The soldier who could not sleep without them when he came home, what was he? No one asked. Or rather, the question was asked and then set aside, because there were more pressing commercial conversations to have. The molecule was too useful to leave alone. It always had been. Locked to voice, locked to outline. Generating Section 3 now. There is a particular species of American optimism that believes every problem is at its core a logistics problem, not a moral problem, not a structural problem, not a problem rooted in the conditions under which human beings are asked to live and what those conditions do to the human body over time. A logistics problem, something that can be solved by the correct application of the correct technology, efficiently distributed at a price the market will bear. In the 1950s, America decided that obesity was a logistics problem, and the molecule was available. To understand how amphetamine moved from the bomber cockpit to the bathroom cabinet, from a wartime military supply item to the most popular diet aid in the history of American pharmacy, you have to understand something about the specific texture of post-war American culture, and specifically about what the post-war era did to the American body and the American relationship to that body. The men had come home. The economy was growing at a pace that felt, to a generation that had survived the Depression and the war, almost supernatural. Suburbs were being built, automobiles were being purchased, refrigerators were being filled. The physical activity of agricultural and industrial labor, the kind of work that had kept earlier generations lean without any particular intention on their part, was being replaced for a growing portion of the American middle class by desk work, automobile travel, and an abundance of processed food that the wartime economy had perfected, and the peacetime economy was now mass-producing with extraordinary efficiency. People were gaining weight. This was not mysterious. The caloric arithmetic was not complicated. What was complicated was the cultural response to it, which was not primarily to examine the conditions that produced the weight gain, but to locate the solution in a pill. The pharmaceutical industry, which had spent 15 years building an infrastructure around a stimulant molecule that suppressed appetite as a secondary effect, was ready to help. The company that stepped forward most aggressively was not Smith, Klein, and French, though they watched with interest. It was a smaller operation, a pharmaceutical company in Brooklyn, New York, that called itself Obetrol Pharmaceuticals, and whose product was ambitious in a way that only a company unencumbered by excessive regulatory caution could manage to be. Obetrol, the product named after the company, was a diet pill. It was also, if you read the ingredient list with any pharmacological literacy, a remarkably concentrated delivery mechanism for multiple forms of amphetamine and methamphetamine simultaneously. The original formulation contained 4 active ingredients: racemic amphetamine sulfate, dextroamphetamine sulfate, methamphetamine saccharate, and methamphetamine hydrochloride. 2 forms of amphetamine, 2 forms of methamphetamine, in a single tablet for weight loss, sold initially in doses of 10 and 20 milligrams, in tablets that were, and this detail will become important later, blue and orange. Why 4 different salts? The pharmacological justification was that different salt forms were absorbed at different rates, producing a smoother, more sustained effect than a single compound would provide. This may have been true. The less charitable explanation, offered by some historians of the period, is that a product with 4 active ingredients simply looked more sophisticated, more scientific, more engineered than a product with 1, and that in the marketplace of the 1950s, complexity was a form of credibility. Either way, the pills existed, and they worked in the narrow sense that amphetamine always works as an appetite suppressant, because the same neurochemical mechanism that floods the brain with dopamine and norepinephrine, producing the focused, energized alertness that soldiers had come to rely on in the Pacific and the Ardennes, also signals to the body that this is not the moment for hunger. The body, under amphetamine, becomes convinced that it is in a situation requiring total attention, and hunger, that gentle, insistent signal of ordinary biological need, is suppressed accordingly. You lose weight until you stop taking the pill, and then the hunger returns, and with it, in many cases, the weight. But the 1950s were not a decade that spent much time examining the long-term consequences of its solutions. The 1950s were interested in the solution. The FDA formally approved Obetrol for the treatment of what it termed exogenous obesity on January 19, 1960. Exogenous obesity. Obesity caused by external factors, by overeating as distinguished from endocrine or metabolic causes, was the diagnosis that covered, in practice, most of the people who walked into a physician's office and asked for help losing weight. The approval was specific, but the application was general. And once a drug has FDA approval for a condition as common as weight gain in post-war America, the distance between the approved indication and the actual practice of prescription is, historically, not very large. Diet doctors proliferated. This is perhaps the mildest way to describe what happened. Physicians who specialized in weight loss established practices in which the primary tool was the prescription pad and the primary product was amphetamine. The economics were stunning. One dispensing diet doctor of the era reportedly purchased 100,000 amphetamine-containing tablets for $71 and sold them to patients for $12,000. The markup was not subtle. The practice was not marginal. By the early 1960s, diet doctors were among the most financially successful physicians in America, and the pills they dispensed were, in many cases, formulations nearly identical to what the Wehrmacht had been issuing to its infantry 20 years earlier. The pills even had a nickname. People called them rainbow pills, because the various amphetamine preparations came in different colors, depending on the manufacturer and the formulation, and patients would sometimes be given different colors for morning and evening doses, or switched between formulations depending on what the doctor had in stock. Rainbow pills. The name has a lightness to it that is almost pleasant, almost whimsical, and that contains absolutely no information about the pharmacological reality of what was being consumed in rainbow quantities by millions of American women, and it was predominantly women, who had been told by their physicians and their culture and the advertisements in their magazines that the correct size of a body was a specific size, and that the chemistry existed to achieve it, and that there was nothing particularly alarming about this. Andy Warhol took Obetrol. This detail surfaces in the historical record with the particular specificity that makes it feel true rather than anecdotal. Warhol received a prescription for Obetrol in 1963, and it became, by his own account and the accounts of those around him, his drug of choice. The clarity it produced, the energy, the sustained capacity for work that stretched across the long, strange days of the factory, where the pace of production was itself a kind of performance, where the boundary between work and art and social existence had been dissolved into a single continuous stream of activity that the unaugmented human body might have found difficult to sustain. He was on his way to the pharmacy to collect his Obetrol prescription on the morning of June 3rd, 1968, when Valerie Solanas shot him in the chest. He survived. He continued to take Obetrol. He is not in this story a cautionary tale. He is a data point that illustrates the breadth of the molecule's reach in the 1960s, the way it had embedded itself not just in the medicine cabinets of suburban households, but in the studios and factories and social laboratories of American culture, touching the lives of artists and housewives and soldiers turned office workers and diet clinic patients with the indiscriminate generosity of something that had, by this point, become infrastructure. By 1970, 5% of all Americans, approximately 9.7 million people, were using some form of prescription amphetamine. 9.7 million people, on speed, legally, with a prescription, in 1970. The number arrives and sits there, patient and enormous, and asks you to consider what it means that a molecule synthesized accidentally in Berlin in 1887, rediscovered by a man looking for a cheaper asthma remedy in 1927, weaponized for soldiers in 1942, and repackaged as a diet aid in 1960, had, by 1970, become the pharmaceutical backdrop against which nearly 10 million Americans conducted their ordinary daily lives. And then, with the particular abruptness that characterizes regulatory responses to problems that have been politely ignored for too long, the reckoning arrived. It had been building. The evidence had been accumulating for years. In the medical literature, in the case reports of physicians who were seeing the consequences of long-term amphetamine use in their practices, in the accounts of people who had stopped taking the pills and discovered that the stopping was considerably less comfortable than the starting had been. Psychosis, hallucinations, paranoia, cardiovascular strain, the specific hollow quality of the crash that followed the peak. The hours or days after the stimulant cleared the system, when the brain, depleted of its artificially elevated neurotransmitters, produced a flatness so profound it felt like a physical weight. Addiction, though the era was still working out its vocabulary for this particular phenomenon in the context of legal pharmaceuticals, the FDA began moving. In 1965, the agency banned the Benzedrine inhalers completely and restricted amphetamines to prescription use only. A significant step, though it did not address the diet doctor industry that had already made prescription access a largely administrative rather than medical hurdle. Congressional hearings were held. Questions were asked about the appropriateness of prescribing powerful stimulants to millions of people for weight management, about whether the evidence base for the practice was as robust as the prescription rates implied, about whether the pharmaceutical companies that were profiting from the practice had been entirely straightforward in their representations to the medical community. The questions were reasonable. The answers, when they came, were uncomfortable. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act classified amphetamines as Schedule II drugs, the highest level of restriction applied to substances with recognized medical uses. Schedule II meant high potential for abuse, severe psychological or physical dependence, and tight regulatory oversight of production and distribution. It was, in the language of federal drug policy, a significant statement about what the government now believed amphetamine to be. The same government that had distributed between 250 million and 500 million tablets of the same compound to its own soldiers 25 years earlier. The irony of this is not difficult to locate. It is simply difficult to know what to do with it. Obetrol, under the mounting pressure of regulatory scrutiny and the increasingly inhospitable climate for amphetamine-based weight loss products, was withdrawn from the market in 1973 under what was known as the DESI statute, the Drug Efficacy Study Implementation Program, through which the FDA was reviewing drugs approved before 1962 to determine whether their efficacy had actually been established to modern standards. The review was not kind to many products of the Diet Doctor era. Obetrol disappeared from pharmacy shelves, or appeared to. The reality was more complicated and more consequential than a simple withdrawal. Pharmaceutical, the company that had absorbed Obetrol Pharmaceuticals and continued to manufacture the product, faced a regulatory environment that required them to remove the methamphetamine salts from the formulation. The two methamphetamine components of the original four-part formula had become, by the early 1970s, politically untenable in a way that the two amphetamine components had not quite yet managed to be. So Rexar reformulated. They removed the methamphetamine saccharide and the methamphetamine hydrochloride. They replaced them with two additional amphetamine salt forms, maintaining the four-component structure of the original pill, but substituting chemically related amphetamines for the methamphetamine components. The result was a tablet containing, in equal proportions, dextroamphetamine sulfate, dextroamphetamine saccharate, amphetamine sulfate, and amphetamine aspartate. They continued to sell this reformulated version under the name Obetrol, without FDA approval for the new formulation. This detail, the continued sale of a reformulated product without resubmitting for regulatory approval, would eventually attract the FDA's attention, but not immediately, not for years. The regulatory apparatus of the early 1970s was not in practice sufficiently resourced to track every reformulation of every product from every small pharmaceutical company operating in Valley Stream, New York. Rexar was not a major player. Obetrol was not a major product. It continued to exist in the dim margins of the pharmaceutical market, not widely prescribed, not widely discussed, not quite gone. The molecule, as it always did, waited. It had been waiting, after all, for 40 years in Edelianu's footnote before Gordonales found it. Waiting was something it was good at. The 1970s passed. The 1980s arrived with their own anxieties and their own pharmaceutical solutions. The Diet Doctor industry contracted under regulatory pressure. The rainbow pills of the 1960s became, in cultural memory, a slightly embarrassing episode in American pharmaceutical history. Something that people who had been adults in that era remembered with a mixture of nostalgia and unease, the way one remembers a bad decision that one somehow survived without consequence. but in the corporate ledgers of a pharmaceutical company in Brooklyn that had been absorbed into a slightly larger pharmaceutical company in Valley Stream. A formula persisted. A patent persisted. An intellectual property chain persisted, linking the Obetrol of the 1950s to its reformulated descendant through a series of corporate transactions that are not glamorous to describe, but are essential to understand. Because in 1993, a small pharmaceutical company in Florence, Kentucky, noticed that chain and saw something in it that almost no one else had seen. An opportunity, not to sell a diet pill. The era of the diet pill, at least in this particular chemical form, had passed. What they saw was something more audacious, more profitable, more durable. A new diagnosis was consuming American psychiatry. A new population of patients was emerging from the schools and the pediatric offices and the behavioral assessments of an educational system that had spent the 1980s becoming increasingly intolerant of children who could not sit still. A new market was forming, vast and growing and entirely legitimate, for a medication that could produce in an inattentive, restless, impulsive child the focused, manageable, compliant behavior that classrooms required. And the molecule, it turned out, could do that too. It had always been able to do that. The question that the Kentucky Pharmaceutical Company was asking in 1993, with the very particular focus of people who have identified a commercial opportunity, was simply whether anyone would notice that the new miracle medication for children with attention disorders was, underneath its new name and its new indication and its new orange and blue capsule design, the same compound that had been sitting in a Brooklyn warehouse since 1960, under a name that had become, by the 1990s, sufficiently obscure that almost no one would make the connection. They would not notice. Or rather, they would not be asked to notice. The renaming was about to begin. There is a game that language plays with us, and we let it play the game because the alternative, insisting on precision at every moment, demanding that every name carry the full weight of what it describes, is exhausting in a way that daily life cannot sustain. We call a thing by a new name, and we experience it to some meaningful degree as a new thing. This is not stupidity. It is not gullibility. It is simply how human cognition works. How we process novelty, how we organize experience, how we construct the categories through which we navigate a world that contains more information than any individual mind can hold. Names do not merely describe, they shape. They determine what questions get asked and which ones do not, what histories get carried forward and which ones are left behind. What a parent in a pediatrician's office in 1997 thinks she is handing her 7-year-old with a glass of water every morning before school. The people at Rewired Pharmaceuticals understood this, whether they understood it in precisely these terms, whether they sat in a conference room in Florence, Kentucky in 1993 and articulated the cognitive mechanics of renaming with the clarity of a semiotics lecture, is not something the historical record makes available. What the historical record makes available is the outcome, and the outcome suggests a clear, sophisticated understanding of exactly how much work a name can do. To arrive at Rewired, we need to follow the corporate lineage of Obetrol through the years of its apparent disappearance. After its 1973 withdrawal from the market under the DESI statute, the reformulated Obetrol, the version with methamphetamine removed, the version containing the 4 amphetamine salts that would eventually become Adderall, continued to exist in the manufacturing infrastructure of Rexar Pharmacal. Rexar was not a prominent company. It operated in Valley Stream, New York. It had absorbed Obetrol Pharmaceuticals sometime before 1972, and it continued to produce and sell the reformulated amphetamine mixed salts product under the Obetrol name without, as previously noted, having resubmitted the reformulated product for FDA approval. This was a regulatory irregularity. Not a dramatic one, not the kind of irregularity that generates headlines or congressional inquiries, but the kind that accumulates quietly in the paperwork of a small pharmaceutical company until someone eventually notices. The FDA eventually noticed. The result was a warning letter. Rexar, faced with the warning, was in a difficult position. The company was small. The product was obscure. The regulatory path to formal approval for the reformulated Obetrol would require resources and attention that a company of Rexar's size might struggle to commit. And then, in 1993, Richwood Pharmaceuticals arrived. Richwood was a specialty pharmaceutical company based in Florence, Kentucky, and it was, by the early 1990s, looking for something specific. The ADHD market, the market for medications to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in children, was growing with a velocity that pharmaceutical companies were tracking with considerable attention. Ritalin, the methylphenidate-based stimulant that had been approved for use in children with behavioral problems since 1961, had seen its prescription rates quadruple between 1987 and 1996. The diagnosis of ADHD was expanding. The population of patients was expanding. The revenue opportunity was expanding. And Ritalin had competitors. Amphetamine-based treatments for what would eventually be called ADHD had existed in various forms since the 1930s. A physician named Charles Bradley had published a landmark paper in 1937 describing the remarkable calming effect of Benzedrine on behaviorally disordered children, a finding that had generated considerable interest and then been largely set aside during the war years. Benzedrine, a pure dextroamphetamine preparation, had been available for decades. The pharmacological principle that stimulants counterintuitively produced in many hyperactive and inattentive children a calming, focusing effect was not new. What was new was the scale of the market. The DSM-3, published in 1980, had formally introduced the diagnosis of attention deficit disorder, ADD, into American psychiatry, expanding the definition of hyperkinetic childhood behavior into a clinically codified condition with specific diagnostic criteria and, implicitly, a specific treatment pathway. The DSM-3R, published in 1987, had renamed it Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, and consolidated the subtypes into a single diagnosis. The DSM-4, published in 1994, refined the criteria further, identifying 3 presentations: predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive impulsive, and combined. Each revision of the diagnostic criteria brought more children within the definition's reach. Each expansion of the definition expanded the population eligible for medication. Each expansion of the population eligible for medication expanded the commercial opportunity for pharmaceutical companies with a product to offer. Before 1970, the diagnosis of ADHD was relatively rare for schoolchildren and essentially non-existent for adolescents and adults. Between 1980 and the mid-1990s, prevalence estimates in American schoolchildren moved from approximately 1% to 4 or 5%, and the direction of travel was unmistakably upward. Richwood, looking at this landscape in 1993, saw what a company with a specific kind of vision sees: an underserved market, an existing molecular asset, and a regulatory path that, while not trivial, was navigable. They acquired Rexar Pharmacol. The acquisition brought with it the manufacturing facilities in Valley Stream, the corporate history of Obetrol Pharmaceuticals, the formula for the reformulated amphetamine mixed salts product, and the outstanding question of what to do about the FDA warning regarding the unapproved reformulation. Richwood's answer to that question was elegant in its simplicity. They changed the name. The reformulated Obetrol, the 4-amphetamine salt product that Rexar had been quietly manufacturing since the early 1970s without full regulatory authorization, was renamed. The name they chose was Adderall. The etymology is contested in the minor way that pharmaceutical brand names often are. Some sources suggest it was constructed as a portmanteau of ADD for all, a reading that is either ingeniously transparent or almost comically on the nose, depending on your disposition. Others suggest it was simply a constructed word designed to sound clinical and purposeful, which it does. They submitted the reformulated product for FDA approval under the new name. The application referenced the original Obetrol NDA, the new drug application under which the original formulation had been approved in 1960. The regulatory pathway treated the reformulated Adderall as a continuation of the Obetrol lineage rather than an entirely new product, which reduced the evidentiary burden considerably. You were not, in regulatory terms, introducing a new molecule. You were continuing the history of an existing one, with modifications. The FDA warned Richwood in 1994 about the prior unauthorized sale of the reformulated product under the Obetrol name. Richwood resubmitted. The agency reviewed. On February 13, 1996, the FDA approved Adderall for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The pills that appeared in pharmacies across America in 1996 were blue and orange, the same colors as the Obetrol tablets. The same compound, in the same proportions, in the same two colors, now carrying a new name and a new indication. Not obesity, which had become pharmacologically unfashionable, but ADHD, which was pharmacologically ascendant. Not for adults trying to lose weight, which was the application that had accumulated enough public and regulatory skepticism to become untenable. For children, for the children who couldn't sit still, for the children whose teachers had sent notes home, for the children whose brains. This was the formulation the era was developing, the explanation that would become the dominant cultural narrative within a decade. Were chemically deficient in ways that expressed themselves as inattention and impulsivity, and an inability to perform the sustained focused labor that the modern classroom required. The children had a disorder. The disorder had a name. The name had a medication. The medication was an amphetamine. Nobody mentioned Obetrol. This is not a conspiracy. It requires clarification because the word conspiracy is often applied to histories like this one, and the application is almost always imprecise. A conspiracy requires active coordination to conceal information for a shared purpose. What happened with Adderall's origins was something more mundane and in many ways more troubling. The information was available. The connection between Obetrol and Adderall was traceable in the public regulatory record, and the question simply was not asked. By physicians, by regulators, by the journalists covering the rapid expansion of ADHD diagnoses and stimulant prescriptions, by the parents handing their children the blue and orange tablets every morning. The name had changed. The history had not changed. But the name carries so much weight. The clinical weight of a new indication, the cultural weight of a newly understood disorder, the commercial weight of a company that was investing heavily in educating physicians about ADHD and its treatment, that the history beneath it became, for most practical purposes, invisible. In 1995, Richwood merged with Shire Pharmaceuticals, a British specialty pharmaceutical company with the resources and the distribution infrastructure to take Adderall from a niche product to a dominant one. Shire Richwood, soon simply Shire, began the systematic work of market development that the pharmaceutical industry describes as physician education, and that its critics describe rather more pointedly. The details of Shire's marketing practices in the late 1990s and early 2000s have been extensively documented in legal proceedings and investigative journalism. What the documentation shows, broadly, is a company that invested substantial resources in ensuring that physicians understood ADHD as a condition requiring medication, that parents understood ADHD as a condition whose treatment was both safe and essential, and that the particular amphetamine salt formulation that Shire manufactured was the appropriate treatment for that condition. The diagnosis rate responded accordingly. In the late 1990s, roughly 7% of American children between the ages of 6 and 17 were diagnosed with ADHD. This was already a significant increase from the rates of the 1980s, but the trajectory was not yet finished. Between 1997 and 2014, the diagnosis rate among children continued to climb, an increase of approximately 5% per year through the early 2000s, compounding into a cumulative doubling of the diagnosed population within less than 2 decades. By the early 2000s, the classroom had been transformed, not architecturally, not pedagogically, not in terms of the fundamental relationship between a child and an educational institution that expected that child to sit still for 6 hours in a room designed for compliance and receive information delivered at a pace calibrated to the median, rather than to any individual child's particular tempo of comprehension. The classroom had been transformed chemically. A significant and growing percentage of the children sitting in those rooms every morning had taken a pill before they arrived. A blue and orange pill, or its generic equivalent, containing the same 4 amphetamine salts that Obetrol Pharmaceuticals in Brooklyn had been pressing into tablets since 1960, which were themselves the reformulated descendants of the amphetamine compound that Smith, Klein, and French had been distributing since 1932, which was itself the molecule that Gordon Alice had synthesized while looking for a cheaper asthma remedy and injected into his own body on a June morning in 1929. The river of the molecule ran forward through time, and each generation met it in a new container. Here is a detail that deserves to be held quietly for a moment. The diagnostic criteria for ADHD, the specific behaviors that a child must exhibit to receive the diagnosis, include difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities, often failing to give close attention to details, often losing things necessary for tasks, often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, often having difficulty organizing tasks and activities. These are descriptions of behaviors. They are not descriptions of neurological findings visible on a scan or detectable in a blood test. ADHD is diagnosed behaviorally through rating scales completed by parents and teachers through clinical observation, through the subjective assessment of whether a child's behavior falls outside the range that the environments in which that child exists consider acceptable. The environments in which American children exist, classrooms specifically, had been designed for a particular kind of attention, sustained, quiet, directed toward the material the institution had chosen to present, at the pace the institution had chosen to present it. The child whose attention moved differently, whose brain generated its own momentum rather than accepting the momentum of the lesson plan, whose body needed to move when the institution required stillness. That child was not necessarily disordered. That child may simply have been a child. This is not a simple claim. ADHD is real. The neurological research supporting the existence of meaningful differences in the dopamine and norepinephrine systems of people who meet diagnostic criteria for ADHD is substantial. The suffering of people who genuinely struggle with attention regulation, the jobs lost, the relationships strained, the private shame of a mind that will not do what it is asked, is real and significant and deserves serious clinical attention. But the diagnosis rate cannot have doubled in 17 years because twice as many children suddenly developed a neurological difference. Neurology does not move at that speed. What moved at that speed was the definition, and the awareness, and the availability of a medication that produced, in essentially any child, with or without the neurological profile that the diagnosis was meant to identify, a measurable increase in compliant, sustained, directed attention. The NIMH researcher Judith Rappaport had noted as early as 1970 that stimulants produced similar focusing effects in children with and without behavioral disorders. The pill worked on everyone. This had always been known. It was simply not always mentioned in the contexts where prescribing decisions were being made. The prescriptions continued to climb. Shire continued to grow. By the early 2000s, Adderall XR, an extended-release formulation that Shire introduced in 2001 to extend patent protection as the original Adderall formula faced generic competition, was generating revenues that made the ADHD treatment market one of the most commercially significant in American psychiatry. The molecule that had been forgotten for 40 years, resynthesized by accident, issued to soldiers in the hundreds of millions, repackaged as a diet aid, quietly reformulated and warehoused through the 1970s and 1980s, and then renamed for children in 1996, was now, by any commercial measure, one of the most successful pharmaceutical products in the history of the United States. And the children who had grown up taking it, who had learned to sit still with its help, who had gotten through school with its help, who had formed their understanding of their own cognitive capacities through the lens of what they could accomplish with it in their bloodstream, were becoming adults. Adults who still needed it. Adults who were now discovering that the world beyond the classroom had not become more accommodating to the kind of attention that did not require chemical assistance. That workplaces and graduate schools and the general velocity of adult professional life in the early 21st century had their own version of the classroom's demand for sustained, directed, productive focus. That the economy, the knowledge economy, the attention economy, the productivity economy, had its own expectations, and that those expectations were not designed with the unmedicated human mind as the baseline. The generation that had been prescribed amphetamine at 6 years old was now 25, and the prescription had not ended. It had simply changed forms. And somewhere in Florence, Kentucky, and in the London offices of Shire Pharmaceuticals, and in the quarterly earnings reports reviewed by analysts who tracked the pharmaceutical sector. The numbers reflected this reality with the clean, unambiguous clarity of revenue figures rising year after year. The rebrand had worked more completely, more durably, and with more consequence than perhaps even the people who designed it had fully anticipated. There is a question that a generation has been quietly not asking itself, not because the question is difficult to formulate. The words are simple enough, but because the asking of it requires a willingness to sit with an uncertainty that is, for many people, more uncomfortable than the medication itself, more uncomfortable than the dry mouth, the suppressed appetite, the cardiovascular flutter, the way sleep becomes a negotiation rather than a surrender when the chemistry is still working through the body at 11 o'clock at night. The question is this: who am I without it? Not who am I performing worse as? Not who am I when I am less productive, less focused, less able to meet the expectations of the environments in which I am expected to perform. Those are answerable questions, and the answers are, for many people, genuinely difficult. The job that becomes harder, the lecture that becomes impossible to follow, the report that sits unfinished on the screen while the mind generates its own momentum in 17 directions simultaneously. The question beneath those questions, the quieter one, the one that arrives, if it arrives at all, in the particular stillness of a morning when the prescription has run out, or the pharmacy is closed, or the shortage has made the refill unavailable, and the person who has taken this medication every day since the age of 8 or 9 or 12 is sitting with themselves in a way that they have not, in many years, been asked to do. Who is this? Is this me? Is this what I am underneath the chemistry? This is the question that the medicated generation is beginning to ask. And the asking of it is not simple, because the generation asking it has never, in any meaningful adult sense, known the answer. To understand how we arrived here, how the rebrand of a failed diet pill in 1996 produced, within 2 decades, a generation of adults for whom amphetamine is as ordinary a daily reality as coffee or commuting. It is necessary to follow the prescription data forward through time with the same patient attention that we have followed the molecule itself. The FDA approved Adderall for ADHD on February 13th, 1996. By the late 1990s, Adderall was competing directly with Ritalin for dominance in the ADHD medication market and winning. The amphetamine-based mechanism, the release of dopamine and norepinephrine rather than the reuptake inhibition that methylphenidate produced, generated in the accounts of many patients and physicians a more robust effect, longer lasting, more complete. The extended release formulation that Shire introduced in 2001 under the name Adderall XR stretched the medication's effective window from 4 to 6 hours to 8 to 12, meaning a child could take a single capsule before school and remain, in clinical terms, medicated for the entire academic day. This was marketed as a convenience. It was also, structurally, a 12-hour continuous exposure to amphetamine for a developing brain. The prescription rates in children climbed through the late 1990s and into the 2000s with the consistency of a trend that has found its cultural moment. In 1997 to 1999, approximately 7% of American children between the ages of 6 and 17 had been diagnosed with ADHD. The diagnosis rate, grew at approximately 5% per year through the early 2000s. By 2012 to 2014, over 10% of American children in that age group carried the diagnosis. And of those diagnosed children, roughly 69% were receiving medication. Let the arithmetic settle for a moment. By the early 2000s, more than 1 in 10 American children had been diagnosed with a neurodevelopmental disorder requiring pharmaceutical management. In some states, in some school districts, in some demographic pockets defined by the particular intersection of insurance coverage and educational pressure and diagnostic culture, the rates were substantially higher. And those children were growing up. The first generation of children diagnosed with ADHD and treated with Adderall in significant numbers came of age in the late 2000s and early 2010s. They arrived at college campuses carrying their prescriptions with them, a Schedule II controlled substance that required monthly in-person appointments to refill, a fact that was administratively inconvenient but pharmacologically unambiguous about what category of compound they were managing. What they found on college campuses was something that the architects of the ADHD medication market had not designed, but might, in retrospect, have anticipated. They found demand. Adderall had become, on American university campuses, the most traded informal pharmaceutical in the country. Students who had never received a diagnosis and had never experienced the condition the drug was designed to treat had discovered, through the ordinary social transmission of information in dormitories and libraries and pre-exam study sessions, that amphetamine produced in essentially any human brain, diagnosed or not, ADHD or otherwise, the same effect it had always produced: elevated focus, suppressed hunger, extended productive wakefulness, and the seductive sense that the mind was finally operating at the capacity it had always theoretically possessed. The NIMH researchers' observation from 1970 that stimulants produced similar effects, children with and without behavioral disorders, had arrived 50 years later in the commons rooms of American universities in the form of a blue and orange capsule changing hands between students with the casual normality of a borrowed pen. Survey data from the mid-2000s suggested that between 5 and 35% of college students had used stimulant medications non-medically at least once. The enormous range reflecting the difficulty of gathering honest self-report data on the non-medical use of controlled substances, but the lower bound alone representing millions of students. By the time they graduated, many had crossed the threshold from occasional use to regular use, and many had discovered that stopping regular use produced effects that were not simply the return of pre-medication baseline function, but something considerably less comfortable than that. The campus was not the only place this was happening. In the offices of Silicon Valley technology companies and the trading floors and analysis departments of Wall Street financial institutions, a parallel phenomenon was developing among adults who had either been diagnosed with ADHD in adulthood, a demographic that had grown substantially as the DSM-4's 1994 acknowledgement that ADHD persisted into adulthood became absorbed into clinical practice, or who had found, through routes that the pharmaceutical industry did not officially endorse, that amphetamine produced in the professional context the same enhancement it produced in the academic one: sustained attention, reduced need for sleep, willingness to engage in extended periods of repetitive, detail-oriented work, the capacity to meet a deadline, hit a target, produce at a pace that the knowledge economy required, but the unmedicated human brain did not always naturally supply. Some professionals in high-pressure industries described their stimulant use with the pragmatic straightforwardness of someone describing a nutritional supplement. It was a tool. The work required certain capacities. The medication provided those capacities. The moral calculus was no more complicated in their framing than the calculus around coffee. A socially accepted stimulant whose mechanism of action, while different, was not entirely philosophically dissimilar. The difference, which the coffee analogy elided, was the Schedule II classification, the addiction potential, the cardiovascular consequences of chronic use, the way the brain, under sustained amphetamine exposure, gradually recalibrated its baseline dopamine production downward, compensating for the artificial elevation by reducing the natural supply, until the medicated state became not an enhancement of normal function, but a restoration of a baseline that the medication itself had lowered. A 2022 review found that nearly 25% of individuals prescribed stimulant medications for ADHD developed tolerance within days to weeks of beginning treatment. 25% within days to weeks. The tolerance was not dangerous in the immediate clinical sense. It did not produce the acute medical crisis that tolerance to opioids or benzodiazepines could produce. But it was pharmacologically significant. It meant that the dose required to produce the original effect increased. It meant that the cessation of the medication produced a withdrawal that was more pronounced, more disorienting, more difficult to distinguish from the disorder the medication was treating. Because the symptoms of Adderall withdrawal and the symptoms of untreated ADHD looked from the outside, and sometimes from the inside, remarkably similar. Fatigue, difficulty concentrating, emotional dysregulation, inability to sustain attention, irritability, a flatness that some people described as depression, and others described simply as the sensation of being themselves without the chemistry. This last description is the one worth sitting with, the sensation of being themselves without the chemistry. For a person who received their first prescription at the age of 7 and is now 32, this is not a theoretical question about baseline function. It is a genuine epistemological problem. There is no adult self that exists prior to the medication. The medicated state is not the modified state. It is, in the only experiential sense that matters, the original state. The self that existed before the prescription is not remembered. It cannot be remembered. It was too young and too briefly unmedicated in any conscious adult sense to have left behind any usable record. What exists instead is a daily pharmaceutical dependency, legal, prescribed, monitored by a physician who sees the patient for 15 minutes once a month, and the quiet background hum of a question that the dependency makes very difficult to answer. Shire, which had by this point become one of the most profitable specialty pharmaceutical companies in the world on the strength of its ADHD portfolio, was aware that the adult market was growing. They had been investing in it deliberately. The regulatory expansion of ADHD diagnosis into adulthood, formalized in the DSM-4, normalized in clinical practice through the 1990s and 2000s, had created a second commercial wave that extended the revenue opportunity from childhood medication through the entire productive lifespan of the patient. In 2007, Shire introduced Vivance, lisdexamfetamine, a prodrug formulation of dextroamphetamine that required metabolic conversion in the body before becoming active, theoretically reducing its abuse potential by eliminating the possibility of snorting or injecting it for a faster effect. Vyvanse was positioned as the next generation of ADHD treatment, smoother, longer lasting, with a more gradual onset and offset than immediate-release Adderall. It was also, from Shira's perspective, a patent-protected product in a market where Adderall's original formulation had faced generic competition since 2002. By 2023, Vyvanse was posting annual sales of between $2.5 and $3 billion. A single medication, a single calendar year, $2.5 to $3 billion. The molecule that Gordon Alice synthesized while looking for a cheaper asthma remedy that soldiers carried in their breast pockets at 30,000 feet, that suburban housewives took for weight loss under the warm fluorescent lights of diet doctor offices, that a Brooklyn pharmaceutical company pressed into blue and orange tablets and called Obetrol, that a Kentucky company rebranded for children and called Adderall. That molecule, in its most recent pharmaceutical costume, was generating $3 billion of annual revenue from a single product in a single year. This is not presented as an argument that the medication should not exist. That argument is considerably more complex than this story has the space to make, and it involves the genuine suffering of people for whom the medication represents the difference between a functional life and one that is not. It is simply a number that deserves to be seen clearly, without the softening influence of the clinical language in which it is usually embedded. $3 billion. From a reformulated diet pill, from a wartime stimulant, from a molecule that a Romanian chemist in Berlin considered pharmaceutically valueless in 1887 and set aside. Meanwhile, the generation that had grown up taking it was navigating something that the prescription data could not quite capture, and that the pharmaceutical industry had no particular commercial incentive to examine too closely. They were discovering what dependence looked like when it wore the face of medicine. Not the dramatic dependence of the street addict, the collapsed vein, the desperate transaction, the life visibly organized around procurement and use. Something quieter, more respectable, more difficult to name, and therefore more difficult to examine. The professional who couldn't get through a workday without it. The graduate student who had not written a word unmedicated since her sophomore year of college and was no longer certain she could. The parent who took it to manage the administrative complexity of a household and a career and the particular cognitive load of contemporary adult life, and who had, over years, stopped being able to tell whether the medication was treating a disorder or simply compensating for the gap between what the modern world demanded and what the unmedicated human brain was designed to supply. The stimulant prescriptions increased 14% between 2020 and 2022. Among young adults aged 22 to 44, the increase was closer to 50% over the 4 years between 2018 and 2022. The COVID-19 pandemic had accelerated telehealth, and telehealth had made ADHD prescriptions, already subject to a regulatory framework that required monthly in-person visits for Schedule II drugs, suddenly accessible through a video call from a home office. The diagnostic barrier, already permeable, became more permeable. The prescriptions followed. By the end of 2022, stimulant prescriptions in the United States had reached 80.8 million annually, up from 50.4 million in 2012, a 60% increase in a decade. 60% in a decade. This is not the profile of a medication treating a stable prevalence condition. It is the profile of a market expanding faster than the population, faster than diagnostic criteria can account for, faster than any honest epidemiological model of neurodevelopmental disorders would predict. It is the profile of something that is being consumed not only by the people for whom it was designed, but by an entire civilization that has decided, in the aggregate and largely without discussing it in those terms, that chemical cognitive enhancement is a reasonable response to the gap between human neurological capacity and the demands of the world it has built. The soldier's pill, the housewife's diet aid, the child's focus medication, the adult's productivity tool, the same molecule. Every time. In a new container with a new name, aimed at a new anxiety that turned out to be underneath the contemporary language in which it was expressed. The same anxiety it had always been. The anxiety of being a human body in a world that keeps asking more of it than it was designed to give. And then, in October of 2022, the world that had been asking this of millions of people did something that it had not previously been forced to do. It ran out. In October of 2022, the Food and Drug Administration issued an announcement. It was not dramatic in its language. Federal announcements rarely are. The prose was measured, bureaucratic, careful in the way that institutional communications are careful when they are delivering information that they understand will be received as considerably more alarming than the language in which it is delivered. The announcement stated that there was a shortage of amphetamine mixed salts, the compound sold under the brand name Adderall and its generics, and that this shortage was affecting patients nationwide. The shortage, the announcement explained, was the result of manufacturing delays. This was true in the narrow way that a part of a story can be true, while the whole of it remains untold. The manufacturing delays were real, but manufacturing delays do not happen in isolation. They happen at the intersection of supply and demand, and the demand side of the Adderall equation had been building toward this moment for years, with the patient inevitability of a pressure system that everyone can see on the map, but that no regulatory mechanism had moved quickly enough to address. The DEA, which controls the production quotas for Schedule II controlled substances, the annual limits on how much of a given compound can be manufactured in the United States, had not kept pace with the prescription growth that had been climbing at 60% over the previous decade. The logic of the quota system is sound in principle. Schedule II drugs carry the highest abuse potential of any compounds with recognized medical use. Controlling how much can be produced limits the supply available for diversion, for black markets, for the non-medical use that has always run parallel to the medical use of this molecule, like a shadow that the official history prefers not to examine directly. The quota system was designed, in other words, as a safeguard. What it became in the context of 60% prescription growth and manufacturing bottlenecks and the telehealth expansion of the COVID years was a constraint that the system could not adjust to quickly enough. The quotas had been set for a market that no longer existed. The market that now existed was substantially larger, substantially more dependent, and, crucially, substantially less equipped to manage an interruption in supply than any previous iteration of the amphetamine market had been. Because this time, the people who couldn't get their medication were not soldiers who could be reassigned. They were not diet clinic patients who could, with difficulty and discomfort, simply stop attending their appointments. They were people who had been taking this medication every day, often since childhood, who had organized their lives, their work, their relationships, their understanding of their own cognitive capacities around its reliable presence. 15.5 million adults, 7 million children. These are the numbers that the shortage made visible, not created. They had existed before October 2022, embedded in the prescription database, with the quiet enormity of a fact that no one had assembled into a single figure and placed in front of the public. The shortage assembled it. The shortage said, with the blunt clarity that only deprivation produces, this many people cannot function by their own account and by the account of the physicians who treat them without daily access to a Schedule II amphetamine. 22.5 million people. For some of them, the interruption was manageable, an inconvenience, a week of difficulty, of calling pharmacy after pharmacy, of driving to a neighboring county where supply was slightly less, constrained, of managing on a lower dose or a different formulation while the distribution chain slowly stabilized. For these people, and they existed in significant numbers, the shortage was a reminder of dependency without constituting a crisis. For others, it was a crisis. The withdrawal from amphetamine is not, in the clinical literature, classified as medically dangerous in the way that alcohol withdrawal or benzodiazepine withdrawal is classified. It does not produce seizures. It does not carry in the standard risk assessment framework the acute mortality risk that withdrawal from certain other dependency-producing compounds carries. The clinical literature in this respect is technically accurate and substantially incomplete. What it does produce, what it produces reliably in people who have taken therapeutic doses of amphetamine daily for years or decades, is a constellation of symptoms that the clinical language describes as fatigue, dysphoria, hypersomnia, increased appetite, and cognitive impairment, and that the people experiencing them describe in rather different terms. A fog. People use the word fog with a consistency that suggests it is not metaphor but phenomenology, the accurate description of a perceptual state in which the world has become less distinct, less accessible, less navigable. The clarity that the medication produced, the sense that the mind had been organized, that attention had edges, that the distance between intention and action had been shortened to something manageable, is replaced by its absence, and the absence has a texture. It is not simply the neutral state that existed before the medication. It is a state shaped by the expectation of the medication, by a brain that has spent years calibrating its dopamine production to the assumption of daily amphetamine, and that now, in the absence of that input, produces something that feels less like natural function and more like a room after the lights have been switched off. Depression in many cases. Not the clinical depression of a DSM diagnosis, though the line between stimulant withdrawal dysphoria and a depressive episode is in practice genuinely difficult to draw. Something more specific than depression. The particular quality of a mind that has been shown a version of itself it preferred and is now being denied access to that version, with no clear timeline for when access will be restored. And underneath the depression, for many people, the question that this entire section of the story has been circling: who am I without it? The shortage did not produce an answer to that question. What it produced was the enforced confrontation with the asking of it. The removal of the daily pill that had, for many people, functioned not merely as a treatment, but as a buffer against the question itself, a way of not having to know what the unmedicated self felt like, because the unmedicated state never lasted long enough to constitute a self. The shortage lasted long enough. for parents managing children who had been on stimulants since elementary school and who were now watching those children struggle through school days that had become, without the medication, nearly unnavigable. The shortage was a specific and practical horror that had nothing to do with philosophical questions about identity. It had to do with a child crying at the kitchen table because homework that had been manageable was no longer manageable, and the pharmacy 3 miles away had been out of stock for 11 days, and the pharmacy across town was out of stock too. And the manufacturer's website said supply was expected to normalize within 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. Meanwhile, the black market did what black markets always do when legal supply becomes constrained. It filled the gap. The market for counterfeit prescription stimulants, for pills manufactured to look identical to pharmaceutical Adderall, in the same colors with the same markings, sold through channels that the shortage had made suddenly attractive to people who would, under normal supply conditions, never have considered them, expanded with the momentum of a market that had found its moment. And the counterfeit pills were not what they appeared to be. The Drug Enforcement Administration, conducting laboratory analysis of pills seized from the illegal market, found something that elevated the shortage from a public health inconvenience to a public health emergency of a different order entirely. 7 out of every 10 pills seized from the illegal market, pills that had been sold as Adderall, that looked like Adderall, that the people purchasing them believed to be Adderall, contained a lethal dose of fentanyl. 7 out of 10. The counterfeit pill industry, primarily operated by criminal networks manufacturing in Mexico from precursor chemicals sourced in China and distributed in the United States through social media platforms, encrypted messaging applications, and street-level dealers, had industrialized the production of fake prescription medications to a scale and a sophistication that made visual identification essentially useless as a safety measure. The pills were pressed with the same dyes, in the same colors, with the same markings as pharmaceutical product. They were indistinguishable to the eye, and they were killing people. In November of 2025, the DEA's Rocky Mountain Field Division announced the seizure of 1.7 million counterfeit fentanyl pills from a single storage unit in Colorado. 1.7 million pills in a storage unit that had been purchased at auction by a civilian who had no idea what it contained. This was described in the DEA's press release as the 6th largest pill seizure in the agency's history. The 6th largest, which means that 5 seizures of equivalent or greater scale had already occurred. Among the most commonly counterfeited medications in the fentanyl pill market, alongside Xanax and oxycodone, the other pharmaceutical products whose street demand made them commercially attractive targets for counterfeit manufacture, was Adderall, the molecule that had been issued to soldiers, the molecule that had been prescribed for weight loss, the molecule that had been renamed for children, the molecule that 22.5 million Americans depended on daily. That molecule was now arriving at the doors of people who needed it in a form that had a 70% chance of containing a lethal dose of something else entirely. This is the point in the story where the macro loop, the question planted at the very beginning in the quiet of a Los Angeles laboratory in 1929, in the dark behind the hook of this long night's journey, finally closes. How does the same molecule become both the world's most dangerous street drug and the most prescribed pill in America? The answer, it turns out, is that the distinction was always thinner than the language used to describe it implied. legal and illegal, medicine and drug, treatment and addiction, prescription and dependency. These are categories maintained by institutional consensus, by the decisions of regulatory agencies, by the marketing strategies of pharmaceutical companies, by the diagnostic frameworks of psychiatric associations, by the cultural narratives that determine which forms of chemical dependency are understood as medical conditions and which are understood as moral failures. The categories are not false, but they are constructed. And when the construction fails, when the supply chain breaks, when the legal market cannot meet the demand it has created, when the person who has taken their daily pharmaceutical amphetamine for 20 years finds themselves unable to obtain it through legitimate channels, the constructed distance between the legal molecule and the illegal one collapses with a speed that reveals how much of the distance was always, at bottom, administrative rather than chemical. The soldier who took his bennies before a night patrol and the person buying pills through an encrypted app in 2023 are separated by 80 years of institutional history. They are not in any pharmacologically meaningful sense separated by very much else. The stimulant prescriptions increased 60% between 2012 and 2023. The DEA's production quotas did not keep pace. The telehealth expansion of the pandemic years opened the prescribing infrastructure to a volume of new patients that the manufacturing infrastructure had not been designed to serve. And a generation of people who had been told from the age of 6 or 8 or 12 that their natural minds were medically insufficient without chemical assistance, that the attention they produced without pharmaceutical support was a symptom rather than a way of being, found themselves in the autumn of 2022 confronting a shortage with no end date and a black market with a 70% chance of killing them. This is where the story of the molecule arrives, in the present tense, in the world as it is tonight, not at a resolution. The story of this molecule does not resolve. It has not resolved in 135 years, since Edelianu wrote it down in Berlin and set it aside. And there is no particular reason to believe that it will resolve in the years immediately following this telling of it. The DEA will adjust its quotas, or it will not. The manufacturers will expand their capacity, or they will not. The telehealth prescribing practices that expanded so dramatically during the pandemic years will be regulated more carefully, or they will not. The question of who among the 22.5 million diagnosed patients carries a genuine neurological difference and who carries a diagnosis that the system generated as a solution to a problem the system itself created. That question will continue to be debated in medical journals and courtrooms and living rooms and pediatric offices without arriving at a clean answer, because the question is not the kind that produces clean answers. What remains after the history has been laid out? After the laboratory in Berlin and the Los Angeles chemist and the bomber cockpits and the diet clinics and the Brooklyn Pharmaceutical Company and the Kentucky Rebrand and the orange and blue pills and the quarterly earnings reports and the shortage announcement and the fentanyl counterfeits, and the question that a generation is quietly asking itself in the dark. What remains is something simpler than a conclusion, a recognition that every generation encounters this molecule in the container that its anxieties have prepared for it. The soldier's anxiety about endurance, the post-war culture's anxiety about the body, the pharmaceutical industry's anxiety about revenue, the educational system's anxiety about compliance, the knowledge economy's anxiety about productivity, the parent's anxiety about a child who cannot sit still in a world that requires stillness. The adult's anxiety about a self that feels without the chemistry, somehow insufficient for the life it is being asked to live. The container changes. The anxiety changes, at least in its surface expression. The molecule does not change. Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, arranged in a specific geometry that the human brain recognizes as permission. Permission to focus, to produce, to perform, to be adequate to the demands of the moment, to silence the fish question and the fluorescent hum and the 17 simultaneous channels, and be, for the duration of the chemistry's half-life, exactly what the world is asking you to be. The world has been asking a great deal. The molecule has been answering for nearly a century. And somewhere tonight, in a dormitory, in an office building, in a child's bedroom with the nightlight still on, in a kitchen where a parent is counting what remains of this month's prescription and calculating how many days it needs to last, the question is being lived rather than asked. Not who am I without it? Not yet. That question requires a stillness that the shortage brings and the prescription prevents, and the world with its deadlines and its classrooms and its quarterly targets and its unrelenting appetite for productivity does not often provide. The question being lived is quieter than that, more immediate. The question being lived is simply, will it be available tomorrow? And the answer to that question, unlike most of the questions this story contains, remains genuinely uncertain. Sleep well tonight. You have earned the rest.